What if your loved one's soul knows you are crying for them? The body is gone. The room is silent. Yet according to ancient Vedic teachings, death may not erase every bond in a single moment. The soul begins a journey beyond the physical world, but memory, attachment, prayer, and the grief of those left behind may still carry meaning. So when a family gathers, calls their name, and breaks down in tears, does the departed soul know? Can it feel that sorrow in some deeper way? The answer is more mysterious and more emotional than most people realize. Chapter 1. Death does not erase every bond at once. The moment someone dies, the family sees only what has stopped. The breathing stops. The eyes no longer open. The voice that once answered from another room is suddenly gone. A chair remains empty. A phone number remains saved. Clothes remain where they were left. And the mind begins asking the same painful question: where did they go? Ancient Vedic thought begins by challenging the assumption that the person was only the body lying before you. The body was the instrument through which the soul touched this world. It walked, spoke, embraced, worked, suffered, laughed, and built relationships through that physical form. But when the body can no longer continue, the deeper conscious being is described as moving onward rather than simply disappearing into nothingness. And this matters because a lifetime of love is not created in one day. Think about the strength of a family bond. A mother may recognize her child's footsteps without seeing them. A husband may know from one expression that his wife is worried. A son may hear his father's advice in his mind years after a conversation ended. These connections are built through thousands of repeated moments until they become deeply rooted within us. Vedic philosophy speaks of samskaras, impressions left upon the inner being by experience. Every powerful emotion, relationship, action, fear, desire, and attachment leaves its mark. So why should we assume that the deepest impressions of an entire lifetime vanish at the exact second the heart stops? The physical connection is certainly broken, but the inner impressions may not disappear so quickly. This is why the ancient teachings surrounding death describe a journey rather than an instant erasure. The departed is not portrayed merely as a body that has become useless. The soul is treated as a traveler, leaving one condition of existence and moving toward another. And a traveler who has only just left home may still carry the memory of home, the voices, the faces, the promises, the unfinished conversations, the people whose lives were intertwined with their own. This does not mean the departed remains forever standing invisibly inside the house, watching every movement exactly as before. The Vedic idea is far subtler than that. It suggests that death changes the relationship without necessarily erasing its impressions immediately. That distinction is important because when a family begins grieving, they are not simply mourning an object that has disappeared. They are mourning someone with whom consciousness, memory, duty, and affection were deeply shared. And according to later Hindu teachings surrounding the soul's passage after death, those bonds are treated seriously enough that the behavior, prayers, offerings, and emotional state of the family become part of the sacred period of mourning. So the first lesson is this: do not mistake physical silence for immediate spiritual emptiness. The person may no longer answer through the body you knew, but within the Vedic understanding of death, the soul's journey has only begun. And if the soul still carries impressions of the life it has just left behind, then one disturbing question naturally follows. When the house fills with crying, when relatives call the departed by name, when someone sits beside their photograph and says, "Please come back," does something of that grief reach the soul? That is where the mystery becomes much deeper. Chapter 2. The soul enters a state the living cannot see. The most difficult part of death is not only that someone is gone, it is that the living can no longer see what is happening to them. One moment, the person is here. Their face is familiar. Their voice belongs to the house. Their presence has weight, warmth, and form. Then suddenly, the body becomes still, and everything beyond that moment becomes invisible. But invisible does not mean non-existent. The Vedic tradition describes death as a transition from one state of existence into another. The soul is no longer operating through the physical senses in the same way, yet it is not treated as though it has simply fallen into nothingness. It has entered a condition the living cannot directly observe, and this is where grief becomes so intense, because the family remains on one side of the experience, while the departed has moved beyond the reach of ordinary sight. The mother cries, but cannot know what her child now perceives. The wife speaks to her husband's photograph, but receives no answer. The son stands beside his father's empty bed and wonders whether those words are disappearing into silence or reaching somewhere beyond it. This uncertainty can become unbearable. Yet the ancient teachings do not ask us to imagine the soul as completely unconscious of everything it has left behind. Instead, they describe a journey in which the impressions of earthly life, attachments, duties, desires, and karmic tendencies still matter. That means the soul does not necessarily leave behind every inner connection at the exact moment of death. A lifetime cannot always be released in a single second. Imagine someone leaving a home where they lived for 50 years. Even after they walk through the gate, the home remains alive within them. They remember where the morning light entered. They remember whose footsteps came down the hallway. They remember which voice called them to dinner. Distance changes the relationship, but it does not instantly erase the impressions. In the same way, the soul may move beyond the body while still carrying deep impressions of the life it has just completed. This is why the period after death is treated with such seriousness in later Vedic Hindu traditions. The family does not behave as though nothing remains to be done. They pray, they remember, they perform sacred rites, they speak the name of the departed. They offer water, food, and acts of charity according to their tradition. Why? Because the journey of the soul is understood as meaningful even after the physical relationship has ended. And here we reach something even more powerful. If the soul is passing through a state where its earthly impressions have not been completely dissolved, then the emotions surrounding its departure may also carry significance. The family's love, their prayers, their inability to let go, their peaceful acceptance, their desperate crying. These are not treated merely as random reactions inside a room. They become part of the spiritual atmosphere surrounding death. This does not mean every tear automatically controls the soul's destiny. It means something deeper. The bond between the living and the departed is treated with enough seriousness that grief itself must be handled consciously. Because grief can become two very different things. It can become a blessing that says, "We love you, go in peace." Or it can become an attachment that cries, "Do not leave us, come back." Both come from love, but they do not carry the same spiritual direction. One releases, the other pulls. And this is why the ancient teachings do not merely tell the family how to mourn. They teach the family how to slowly transform mourning from panic into prayer, from possession into remembrance, from desperate attachment into sacred love. Because if the soul is truly moving through a transition beyond our sight, then perhaps the most important thing is not whether we can see the soul. Perhaps the most important thing is what kind of energy we send toward it while it is leaving. And that leads to the question most grieving families are afraid to ask. If we cry too much, can the departed somehow know that we are suffering? Chapter 3. Can the soul know its family is grieving? This is the question that sits quietly inside almost every grieving heart, because once the funeral is over and the house becomes silent, the mind begins searching for some sign that the love shared in life did not suddenly become meaningless after death, and many people find themselves wondering whether the person they lost somehow knows that the family is still crying, whether the soul can sense the heaviness inside the home, whether it understands that someone still sleeps beside an empty space, still reaches for a phone that will never ring, still remembers the final conversation, and still whispers the departed person's name when no one else is listening. Within the broader Vedic and later Hindu tradition, the answer is not presented as though the departed soul continues to observe the world exactly as it did through physical eyes and ears, because death is understood as a profound change in the condition of consciousness. Yet these traditions also do not treat the soul as though it instantly becomes completely disconnected from every impression, relationship, attachment, and emotional bond formed during earthly life. The deeper idea is that the soul has left the physical instrument, but the subtle impressions created through love, memory, desire, duty, and attachment do not necessarily vanish in the same instant, which is why the period following death is treated with such seriousness, and why the family's prayers, rites, remembrance, and emotional state are repeatedly given spiritual importance. The Garuda Purana, which belongs to the later Hindu scriptural tradition surrounding death and the soul's onward journey, contains a striking warning about excessive mourning, teaching relatives to gather courage and restrain uncontrolled crying because the tears and sorrow of those left behind are not portrayed as spiritually meaningless to the departed. This does not mean that grief itself is sinful, nor does it mean that a person should feel guilty for crying after losing someone they deeply loved, because sorrow is a natural human response to separation, but it does suggest that ancient teachers saw a difference between grief that honors love and grief that becomes so desperate that it refuses to allow the departed to continue on their path. Think about what happens when someone dies unexpectedly, because the family often continues speaking to the departed inwardly for days, weeks, or even years, saying things such as, "Why did you leave me? I still need you. Please come back," or "I do not know how to live without you." And although these words arise from pain, they also reveal how strongly the living mind continues to hold the relationship in its previous form. The ancient teachings invite us to ask whether love can become something more mature than holding, whether the deepest form of love may sometimes require us to bless the person we lost, rather than continually calling them back into the world they have already left. Because if the soul is moving through a sacred transition, then constant emotional pulling may be very different from peaceful remembrance. This is why traditional mourning practices do not consist only of crying. They also include prayer, ritual, offerings, remembrance, and acts performed for the welfare of the departed, because grief is meant to be given a direction rather than allowed to become an endless storm. The mourner is gradually guided from the helpless thought, "I have lost everything," toward a more sacred understanding. "I cannot keep this person physically beside me, but I can still honor the bond through prayer, duty, charity, remembrance, and the way I choose to live." In this way, the pain does not disappear, but it begins to transform from something that only wounds into something that carries meaning. There is also an important distinction between saying that the soul may remain connected to the emotional and spiritual atmosphere surrounding its departure, and claiming that it hears every human conversation in exactly the same way it did while alive, because the ancient teachings do not require us to imagine the departed as an invisible physical person standing inside the room. The idea is subtler and more mysterious. Consciousness may no longer function through ordinary senses, yet the impressions of love, attachment, intention, and remembrance may still have relevance during the soul's transition, which is why sacred traditions have always treated words spoken around death with great care. If you have ever stood beside the photograph of someone you lost and spoken to them from your heart, you may understand why this question feels so personal, because what you really want to know is not whether the soul can mechanically hear sound, but whether your love still reaches them in any meaningful way. You want to know whether the person who once understood your smallest expressions now somehow knows that you are hurting, whether the one who once wiped away your tears knows that you are shedding them because of their absence, and whether the bond that felt unbreakable in life continues in some form after the body has disappeared. The ancient answer is not one of certainty about every detail, but it is also not a cold answer of complete disconnection. Instead, it points toward a sacred responsibility in grief by suggesting that what we hold in our hearts matters, that the way we remember matters, and that the direction of our love matters. If the departed soul is still carrying impressions from its earthly life while moving onward, then the most compassionate thing we can send toward it may not be endless desperation, but a love that slowly learns to say, "I miss you more than words can express, but I will not turn my love into a chain around your journey." This is perhaps why the warning against excessive grief is so powerful, because it is not asking you to become emotionally cold. It is asking you to transform the nature of your attachment. It does not say, forget them, but rather, love them in a way that allows both of you to continue. The departed must continue according to the path shaped by karma and the deeper laws of existence, while the living must continue carrying the lessons, memories, and goodness that person left behind. And when both sides are allowed to move forward, grief begins to become something sacred rather than something that destroys everything it touches. So if the soul knows that its family is grieving, the question becomes even more important. What would you want your grief to communicate to the one you lost? Would you want it to say, "I cannot survive without you, so remain tied to my pain"? Or would you want it to say, "You were deeply loved, you are still remembered, and although my heart is broken, I release you with blessing rather than fear"? The second message does not contain less love. In many ways, it contains more, because it accepts that love is sometimes measured not by how tightly we hold on, but by whether we can allow someone to continue on the path that life and death have placed before them. And this leads to an even deeper mystery, because if the soul can in some way remain connected to the sorrow of those left behind, then we must ask whether excessive grief can actually make the soul's transition more difficult, or whether peaceful prayer and loving remembrance can help create a gentler passage. And that is where the next teaching becomes even more powerful. Chapter 4. When grief becomes a chain around the departing soul. There is a painful truth hidden inside grief that very few people are prepared to examine, because when someone we love dies, we naturally believe that the deeper our suffering becomes, the deeper our love must have been. Yet the ancient teachings invite us to consider something far more difficult. There may come a point when grief no longer expresses love alone, but begins to express our refusal to accept that the person we loved has entered a journey that we cannot follow, control, or reverse. The tears themselves are not the problem, because tears are one of the most natural languages of the human heart, but the attachment hidden beneath those tears can become powerful when the mourner repeatedly calls the departed backward through desperate longing, unfinished guilt, fear of being alone, and the inner demand that the relationship must somehow remain exactly as it was before death. Now, this distinction is important because love and attachment often feel identical while a person is alive, yet death reveals the difference between them with extraordinary force. Love can cherish another person while accepting that nothing in the physical world can be possessed forever, whereas attachment quietly says, "You are part of my life, therefore you must remain here in the form I know." When death breaks that expectation, attachment experiences not only sadness but rebellion, because the mind refuses the new reality and begins bargaining with what has already happened, replaying final moments, imagining different outcomes, searching for signs, refusing to move belongings, refusing to enter certain rooms, or whispering again and again, "Please come back to me," as though enough emotional force might reopen a door that physical life has already closed. Within later Hindu teachings surrounding the soul's passage after death, this kind of excessive attachment is treated carefully because the departed is understood to be moving away from one condition of existence and toward another, while the family must gradually release its demand that the soul remain connected to the old world in the same way. This is one reason mourning traditions do not merely tell relatives to feel sorrow without limit. They create a sacred structure around grief, allowing time for crying and remembrance, while also introducing rites, prayers, offerings, duties, and eventual acceptance, because the purpose is not to erase love, but to guide love into a form that does not imprison either the deceased or those who remain behind. Imagine a traveler standing at the edge of a river that must be crossed, while everyone on the shore behind them is calling their name, begging them not to leave, reminding them of everything unfinished, and refusing to accept that their path continues beyond the water. Even if the traveler deeply loves those voices, hearing them might make departure more difficult because every cry directs attention backward toward the place they are meant to leave. Now imagine the same family standing on the shore, with tears in their eyes, but offering a blessing instead, saying, "We will miss you, we will remember you, but go peacefully and complete the journey that is now yours." The pain in the second scene is no smaller, yet the direction of that pain is completely different, because one form of grief attempts to pull the traveler backward, while the other gives the traveler permission to move forward. This is one of the deeper meanings behind the traditional warning against uncontrolled mourning, because the teaching is not cruelly telling a grieving family to stop feeling, nor is it claiming that a few tears will harm the soul, or that someone should feel ashamed because they could not control their sadness at a funeral. Such an interpretation would turn a spiritual teaching into another source of suffering, when its real purpose is the opposite. The warning is about the inner condition of prolonged attachment, about the point where grief begins saying, "Your journey does not matter because I need you here," rather than, "My heart is broken, but I trust that your journey must continue." The Garuda Purana's teachings concerning mourning use strong imagery to emphasize that the sorrow of relatives and the condition of the departed are not regarded as entirely unrelated, and whether one interprets every description literally or understands some of its language symbolically, the spiritual lesson remains remarkably clear. The emotions of the living should gradually be transformed into prayerful remembrance, rather than allowed to become endless emotional possession. In that worldview, the family has a responsibility not merely to mourn the person, but to assist the transition through sacred conduct, because death is understood not as a meaningless collapse, but as a threshold that requires both the departing soul and the surviving family to move from one state into another. This transformation is incredibly difficult because the heart often interprets release as betrayal. A widow may feel guilty the first time she laughs after her husband dies because part of her believes happiness means she has forgotten him. A mother may feel guilty when she experiences a peaceful mourning after losing her child because sorrow has become the final connection she feels she still possesses. And a son may refuse to remove his father's belongings because changing the room feels like accepting that his father will never return. Yet the Vedic understanding of impermanence asks us to see that continuing to live does not erase the dead, just as releasing attachment does not erase love, because memory can remain sacred without requiring the living person to remain trapped forever inside the darkest moment of loss. In fact, one of the most powerful ways to honor someone who has departed is to refuse to allow their death to destroy everything their life gave you. If a father spent decades teaching his children courage, then destroying yourself after his death does not preserve his teaching. Living courageously does. If a mother gave kindness to everyone around her, then continuing that kindness becomes a living continuation of what she placed into the world. If a husband encouraged his wife to follow her purpose, then abandoning that purpose because he died may not be the only way to remain loyal to him. Completing it can become an act of love. When grief is transformed in this way, the departed person is no longer remembered only through the moment of death, because their values continue moving through the actions of the living. This is where grief begins to change from attachment into dharma, because dharma asks not only what we feel, but what we do with what life has placed in our hands. Death places an enormous burden in those hands, and at first the burden feels impossible to carry, yet the tradition offers a path through it by teaching that mourning can gradually become remembrance, remembrance can become gratitude, gratitude can become service, and service can become a living offering to the person who has gone. Instead of asking endlessly, Why were they taken from me? The heart slowly learns to ask, what did their presence teach me, and what can I now carry forward because they existed? Consider how different these two ways of grieving would feel to the departed if the soul was still in some manner aware of the emotional bonds surrounding its transition. In one home, every memory becomes a command to return. Every photograph becomes a wound reopened deliberately. Every conversation repeats the same refusal to accept reality, and the name of the deceased is spoken only with desperation. In another home, there are still tears and empty chairs, and moments when grief arrives suddenly, yet the family also lights a lamp, offers prayer, shares stories, feeds someone in the person's memory, helps those who are suffering, remembers the departed with dignity, and finally says, "We are hurting because we loved you, but we will not ask you to abandon your path because we fear ours." The difference between these two forms of grief is not the amount of love, it is the direction in which love is moving. One direction tries to keep the relationship frozen inside the past, while the other allows the relationship to change its form. Before death, love may have been expressed through preparing meals, holding hands, sharing responsibilities, speaking every day, or simply sitting quietly in the same room. But after death, those physical expressions are no longer possible, and the living must discover a new language for the relationship. That language may become prayer, gratitude, sacred rites, charity, memory, forgiveness, or the quiet decision to live in a way that would have made the departed proud. There is another form of attachment that can be even heavier than longing, and that is guilt, because many grieving people are not only crying for the person they lost, but also punishing themselves for what they did not say or do before death arrived. A daughter remembers the final argument with her mother and wishes she had apologized sooner. A brother remembers that he ignored the last phone call because he was busy. A husband remembers one harsh sentence spoken during an ordinary disagreement and now imagines that sentence as the final truth of an entire marriage. And the mind begins creating a prison built from the words, "if only." If the soul could know the family is grieving, imagine what kind of message endless guilt might send, because instead of remembering decades of love, the mourner reduces the entire relationship to one human mistake and continues suffering as though self-punishment could change the past. The ancient spiritual response to such guilt is not denial of responsibility, but transformation, because if something was left unfinished, the living can honor the departed by becoming different rather than by remaining forever broken. If you regret not expressing love enough, express it more freely to those still beside you. If you regret losing patience with the departed, become more patient with the people who remain. If there was an unresolved wound, offer forgiveness within your heart and allow that forgiveness to reshape your life. You cannot walk backward into yesterday and repair the exact moment that hurts you, but you can prevent that moment from becoming meaningless by allowing it to produce wisdom today. The same is true of fear, because sometimes the mourner holds on to the dead, not only because of love, but because the departed person was the structure around which life was built. And without them, the future suddenly looks empty. A spouse may wonder how to survive financially or emotionally. An elderly parent may wonder who will speak to them every evening. A child may feel that the only person who truly understood them has disappeared. And beneath the grief, there is a terrifying question about identity. Who am I now that they are gone? This is where attachment becomes most understandable, because letting the soul move forward seems to require the survivor to step into a future they never wanted. Yet refusing that future does not restore the person who died. It only creates two losses instead of one: the life that ended and the life that remains but is no longer being lived. The spiritual challenge, therefore, is not to become detached in the sense of becoming cold or indifferent. It is to develop a love strong enough to survive transformation. Weak attachment says, "I can love you only while you remain physically available to me," while deeper love says, "Even when your form is gone, What you awakened within me will continue. This is why the idea of releasing the soul should never be understood as abandoning the person, because release is not forgetting. Release is allowing love to stop fighting reality and begin working with it. There may eventually come a day when the family gathers and speaks about the departed without only describing how they died, because memories of how they lived begin returning. Someone remembers an old joke and the room laughs. Someone tells a story no one else knew. Someone prepares their favorite food, and for a moment the person seems present, not as a suffering absence, but as a beautiful influence that remains woven into everyone sitting there. That moment is one of grief's quiet transformations, because the departed is no longer being pulled backward by desperate memory. Instead, their life is being carried forward through gratitude. Perhaps this is what the ancient teachings are trying to protect when they caution against becoming lost in uncontrolled sorrow. They are not asking the family to close the heart, because a closed heart cannot love. They are asking the family to open the hand. There is a profound difference between carrying someone in your heart and gripping them so tightly in your mind that neither their journey nor your own is allowed to continue. And true spiritual mourning gradually teaches the difference. So if you are grieving someone now, you do not need to become ashamed of your tears, and you do not need to force yourself to feel peaceful before you are ready, because spiritual release cannot be produced through pretending. Let grief move through you honestly, but watch what it slowly becomes. If it says, "I love you," let that love remain. If it says, "I wish I had more time," let that longing remind you how precious time is. But when it begins saying, "I refuse to let you go because I cannot face life without you," recognize that the heart has reached the place where love must evolve. Then perhaps you can begin replacing one inner sentence with another, not because the pain has vanished, but because the direction of your love has changed. Instead of repeating, "Come back, I cannot survive without you," you may slowly learn to say, "I wish you could have stayed, and I will always miss you, but I release you from the burden of my fear. I bless the path that is now yours, and I will try to live the life that remains before me with the love you left inside me." That may be one of the greatest gifts a grieving family can offer the departed soul, because if attachment has the power to pull consciousness toward what it has left behind, then peaceful remembrance may do something entirely different. It may become a silent permission to continue, a blessing offered across a boundary the living cannot cross, and a way of saying that love does not need to imprison someone in order to prove that they mattered. Yet this raises another question that goes even deeper than grief itself. Because if desperate attachment can become a burden, then what happens when a family stops calling the soul backward and begins offering prayers, sacred rites, remembrance, and blessings instead? According to the ancient tradition, those actions are not performed merely to comfort the living. They are connected to one of the most mysterious ideas surrounding death: the possibility that what the family does after death may help guide the departed toward peace. Chapter 5. What the family does after death may matter more than you think. If grief can become a chain that continually pulls the mind toward what has been lost, then the next teaching becomes far more important, because the ancient Vedic and later Hindu traditions did not leave a grieving family with only one instruction to control their tears and somehow endure the emptiness. Instead, they created an entire sacred language of remembrance through which sorrow could be transformed into something meaningful. And this is why prayers, offerings, water, food, charity, remembrance, sacred recitation, and duties performed for the departed became such important parts of the period following death. These practices suggest a powerful idea that many modern people have forgotten. When someone dies, the family may no longer be able to serve the physical person, but love itself does not suddenly become useless, because it can be redirected from physical care towards spiritual remembrance and sacred action. Before death, love usually expresses itself through ordinary things that seem small while they are happening, such as preparing food, asking whether someone has taken their medicine, waiting for them to come home, making space for them at the table, listening to their worries, driving them somewhere, sitting beside them when they are ill, or simply knowing that their presence exists somewhere nearby. When that person dies, all of those familiar expressions of love suddenly become impossible, and this is one reason grief feels so violent, because the heart still wants to give, while the body has nowhere left to deliver what it wants to give. You may wake in the morning with the impulse to call them before remembering that there will be no answer. You may see something they would have loved and instinctively think of buying it for them. Or you may enter the kitchen and almost prepare the food they used to request, only to be struck again by the reality that the person for whom you performed these ordinary acts is no longer physically present. The ancient tradition appears to understand this helplessness deeply, which is why mourning is not presented merely as sitting beside the memory of the dead and suffering until enough time has passed. Sacred rites give grief movement and give love another direction, allowing the mourner to replace the unbearable sentence, "There is nothing more I can do for you," with the spiritually meaningful understanding, "There are still ways in which I can honor your journey." This change may appear small from the outside, but within the heart it can be enormous, because helpless grief freezes a person inside the moment of loss, while sacred action allows that grief to begin moving toward acceptance, duty, gratitude, and peace. This is where the idea of Shraddha becomes especially significant within Hindu tradition, because the word itself carries the sense of an act performed with faith, reverence, and sincerity for those who have departed, particularly the ancestors. The ritual is not meant to be an empty performance completed only because generations before us did the same thing. Its deeper meaning lies in the recognition that death changes the relationship between the living and the departed, but does not make remembrance meaningless. The family can no longer communicate through the ordinary language of daily physical life, so remembrance takes another form, and the relationship that once existed through touch and conversation is expressed through offering, prayer, gratitude, responsibility, and the conscious honoring of ancestry. This is also why water appears with such importance in many post-death rites, because water is one of the most universal symbols of continuity, purification, transition, and life itself. And when water is offered with remembrance, the physical act becomes connected to something deeper than the liquid being poured. The mourner is acknowledging that the departed is no longer being served as an ordinary member of the household, but the bond has entered a sacred dimension in which intention matters greatly. Whether one understands every ritual description literally or symbolically, what cannot be missed is the extraordinary care with which the tradition teaches the living to conduct themselves after death, because the period is understood as spiritually significant rather than emotionally meaningless. Consider what this does to the grieving heart, because before the ritual, the mind may be repeating only the shock of absence, saying that the person is gone, the relationship is over, nothing can be changed, and nothing can be given. But during sacred remembrance, the heart begins speaking another language in which gratitude becomes possible again. Instead of remembering only the hospital room, the final breath, the phone call announcing the death, or the moment the body was taken away, the mourner begins remembering the entire life that came before those final hours, and suddenly death no longer owns the complete story of the person. Their kindness returns to memory, their habits return, their laughter returns, their teachings return, their sacrifices become visible in a way they may never have been while the person was alive, and what was initially experienced only as absence slowly becomes an awareness of everything that was once given. This transformation is crucial because grief has a dangerous tendency to reduce an entire human life to its final moment, especially when the death was sudden, painful, or unexpected. A person may have lived 60 or 70 years, loved hundreds of times, helped countless people, raised children, overcome hardships, created memories, and changed the lives around them. Yet the grieving mind can become trapped inside the final 3 minutes of that entire existence. It keeps replaying the last breath, the accident, the hospital, the unanswered phone call, the terrible message, or the last face it saw, until the death becomes larger than the life itself. And this is precisely where remembrance becomes sacred, because it restores proportion and refuses to allow the final moment to erase everything that came before it. If the soul can in some manner remain connected with the intentions and remembrance of those left behind, then imagine the difference between being remembered only through terror and being remembered through gratitude. In one form of remembrance, every thought says, "Your death destroyed us, nothing will ever be whole again, and we cannot release you." While in another form, the family says, "Your absence hurts us deeply, but your life gave us something that death cannot erase, and we will carry that gift forward." The person has not been forgotten in either case, but the quality of remembrance has changed completely, because one turns memory into a prison, while the other turns memory into an offering. This is also where charity becomes one of the most beautiful ways to transform grief, because when something good is done in memory of the departed, love that seemed trapped by death begins moving again through the world. A meal given to someone who is hungry, help offered to a family in difficulty, care shown to an elderly person, food provided to an animal, a tree planted, knowledge shared, or any sincere act of goodness can become a way of allowing memory to produce life, rather than only sorrow. The person who died may no longer be able to perform those actions physically, yet something inspired by their existence is still creating kindness through the hands of those who remember them, and in this sense love has not been defeated by death. It has simply changed its vehicle. There is something profound about this shift, because grief often asks, "Where can I put all this love now?" And sacred action provides an answer by saying, "Put it into the world." If your mother spent her life feeding people, feed someone in her memory. If your father helped people quietly, continue that generosity. If your spouse encouraged your dreams, honor them by having the courage to continue. If someone you loved taught you compassion, allow their death to make you more compassionate rather than more bitter. These actions do not pretend that the person is still physically present, and they do not deny the pain of losing them, but they prevent love from becoming stagnant by allowing what that person awakened within you to continue moving through your own life. Many people secretly fear that becoming peaceful after a death is a kind of betrayal, because during the first stages of grief, suffering becomes intertwined with loyalty, and the mourner may begin believing that if the pain becomes smaller, then the love must also be becoming smaller. This is why someone can feel guilty for having a good day months after a loss, guilty for laughing with friends, guilty for enjoying a meal, guilty for sleeping peacefully, or even guilty for going several hours without thinking consciously about the person who died. The mind says, "How can I be happy when they are no longer here?" But the deeper spiritual question is whether the departed person would truly want love to become a sentence of lifelong punishment. If the soul knows that its family is grieving, then perhaps one of the saddest things would be for that soul to know that the people it loved have stopped living because of its departure. Imagine a mother who spent her entire life protecting her children, discovering, in whatever form awareness might continue, that one child has now abandoned every possibility of happiness because she died. Imagine a husband who always wanted his wife to be strong, knowing that she has refused to step into the future because his absence made her afraid. Imagine a father who sacrificed everything to give his son opportunities, knowing that the son now believes continuing his life would somehow mean forgetting him. Such suffering might seem like loyalty to the living, but from the perspective of love, it may be the opposite of what the departed would have wanted. This is why peaceful remembrance should not be confused with forgetting, because forgetting means the relationship loses meaning, while peaceful remembrance means the relationship has become strong enough to exist without requiring constant suffering. There may come a time when you can speak the person's name without your voice breaking every time, and that is not evidence that they have become less important. It may be evidence that their memory has finally moved from the wound into the heart. At first, remembering them may feel like touching fire, but gradually the same memory can become warmth. And the day this happens should not be feared, because it represents one of grief's most sacred transformations. The ancient idea of honoring ancestors goes even further, because it suggests that human life is not an isolated event that begins with us and ends with us, but part of a stream flowing through generations. The body you inhabit came through countless lives before yours. Many of the values you carry were shaped by people whose sacrifices you may barely know. And even the language you speak, the traditions you inherit, the stories told in your family, and the way you understand duty all contain traces of those who walked before you. When someone dies, therefore, the relationship does not have to disappear into nothingness. The person can gradually move from being only an individual you once spoke with into becoming part of the ancestry, memory, and inner inheritance from which your own life continues. This perspective completely changes the emotional meaning of death, because instead of saying, "they vanished and left nothing," you begin seeing how much remains. Perhaps their voice remains in the way you speak to your own children. Perhaps their patience remains in how you handle difficulty. Perhaps their courage returns whenever you refuse to give up. Perhaps the recipes they taught you still bring the family together. Perhaps their prayers are repeated by another generation, and perhaps someone who never even met them will one day benefit from a value they placed inside you. The body has disappeared, but the consequences of having lived continue spreading farther than anyone can calculate. At the same time, the tradition reminds us that sacred rites should not become an excuse for obsessive attachment, because there is a difference between honoring the departed and continually trying to keep them psychologically present, as though death never occurred. Ritual is meant to help the relationship transform, not prevent transformation from happening, and this is why the movement of mourning gradually turns from intense, immediate rites toward remembrance integrated into ordinary life. The heart is being taught to understand that love can continue without refusing reality, just as an ancestor can remain sacred without being treated as though they are still physically occupying the same place in the household. This also explains why the intention behind an offering may matter more spiritually than its outward size, because grief sometimes convinces people that they must perform something enormous in order to prove that the departed was loved. Yet love is not measured by extravagance, and a simple act performed sincerely may carry more meaning than an elaborate ceremony performed without understanding. A quiet prayer spoken with gratitude, a small offering made with reverence, a meal given to someone in need, or even a moment of heartfelt remembrance can transform the mourner, because the essential movement is internal. The heart is changing from demanding the person's physical return toward honoring the life that was shared. There is another hidden power in these practices, and that is the possibility of forgiveness. Because many relationships do not end perfectly, death often arrives before apologies are spoken, before misunderstandings are resolved, before estranged relatives return, or before someone finds the courage to say what they have carried silently for years, and afterward the survivor may believe the opportunity for healing has disappeared forever. Yet sacred remembrance can create a space where the living person finally speaks inwardly what they could not speak before, admitting wrongdoing, offering forgiveness, asking forgiveness, or simply acknowledging that both people were imperfect human beings trying to understand one another through the limitations of life. You may never receive a physical answer to such words, and no honest spiritual teaching should promise that you will. But the act can still transform the person who remains, because resentment and guilt no longer have to become the final chapter of the relationship. You can say within your heart, "I forgive what hurt me, and I ask forgiveness for the ways I hurt you." I do not want anger to be the last thing connecting us, and whether those words reach the departed in a metaphysical sense cannot be proven by ordinary means, but they certainly change what you carry forward in your own consciousness. Instead of allowing death to preserve the wound forever, you permit the relationship to end in a deeper place than its unfinished conflict. This may also be why so many traditions teach the living to create a peaceful atmosphere around death, because the final emotional environment matters not only for the departed, but for everyone who remains. Children watching the adults learn how death is understood. Relatives discover whether the family will become divided or united. Old resentments can either become worse or suddenly appear meaningless, and people who rarely speak about love may finally recognize how quickly the opportunity to express it can disappear. A death, therefore, becomes not only the end of one life, but also a severe teacher for the living, forcing everyone present to confront the impermanence they normally avoid. Perhaps this is one of the deepest reasons the rites matter, because ritual slows the family down long enough to face what has happened instead of escaping immediately into distraction. The modern world often encourages people to return to normal as quickly as possible, to answer messages, return to work, hide their tears, and continue functioning. Yet ancient mourning traditions understand that the heart cannot always be commanded to move at the speed of ordinary schedules. The sacred period gives grief a container, allowing sorrow to be acknowledged, while also preventing sorrow from becoming without direction. And within that container, the mourner is slowly reminded that death is part of a greater law of existence rather than a personal violation committed only against them. The Bhagavad Gita expresses one of the central ideas behind this worldview when it distinguishes the eternal self from the temporary body, and uses the image of changing worn-out garments for new ones, an image that has comforted generations because it asks the grieving mind to consider that what has ended may be the physical form, rather than the deepest reality of the being itself. This teaching does not remove the pain of separation, because even if the soul continues, you still miss the face, the voice, the habits, and the physical presence you loved. But it changes the final conclusion from "they became nothing" to the possibility that their journey has moved somewhere my eyes cannot follow. If that possibility is taken seriously, then the family's responsibility after death becomes extraordinarily beautiful, because the goal is no longer to call the traveler backward, but to surround the departure with dignity. The family prays not because it can control the laws governing the soul, but because prayer transforms helplessness into reverence. The family gives not because charity can purchase a different destiny, but because goodness becomes an appropriate language for remembering someone loved. The family performs rites not because grief must become superstition, but because sacred structure helps both memory and acceptance find their rightful place. One of the most powerful changes can happen when the family stops asking only, "Does the soul know that we are grieving?" and begins asking, "If the soul knows anything of us now, what would we want it to know?" Perhaps you would want your mother to know that you finally understood the sacrifices you once took for granted. Perhaps you would want your father to know that his advice still guides you. Perhaps you would want your husband or wife to know that the years shared together were worth the pain of losing them. Perhaps you would want a child who departed too early to know that their brief life changed everyone who loved them. And perhaps you would want anyone you lost to know that their memory will be carried with love, rather than only surrounded by suffering. This is a profound shift because it changes grief from a question into a message. Instead of endlessly demanding evidence that the departed can hear you, you begin choosing carefully what your heart would send if it could be received. And that message slowly becomes cleaner, gentler, and less afraid. In the beginning it may say only, "Come back," but later it may become, "I miss you," and later still, "Thank you," until eventually perhaps it can say, "Go peacefully, what you gave me is safe within my life." That final sentence contains something grief rarely understands at first, because it means that the person no longer has to remain close to your suffering in order to remain important to you. Their significance has become secure enough that you can release the need to prove your love through pain, and the relationship begins moving from possession toward gratitude. You stop asking the memory to replace the physical person and allow memory simply to be memory, beautiful and painful at the same time, while the departed is entrusted to the laws, mysteries, and journey beyond your control. And perhaps this is what the sacred rites have been teaching all along, because beneath the offerings, the prayers, the water, the remembrance, and the gathering of family is one enormous spiritual movement. The living are learning to give rather than grasp. The hands that desperately wanted to pull the person back are slowly opened so they can make an offering. The voice that once shouted, "Do not leave me," learns to speak a blessing, and the heart that believed peace would mean betrayal discovers that peace may actually be one of the purest gifts love can offer. Yet there is still another mystery hidden inside this transition, because family grief does not consist only of tears and rituals. Sometimes the departed begins appearing in dreams, memories become unusually vivid, or a person feels an unexpected sense of presence long after the funeral has ended, and such experiences raise a powerful question that countless grieving people have asked across generations. If the soul has truly begun moving beyond this world, why do some people still feel as though the one they lost is somehow near them? Chapter 6. Why the departed may feel near when the family is grieving. There is a moment in grief that can be even more unsettling than the funeral itself, because after everyone has gone home, after the prayers have ended, after the flowers begin to fade and the house has returned to an unnatural silence, some grieving people begin experiencing something they were not prepared for. The person they lost appears vividly in a dream. Their voice suddenly seems almost present in memory. A familiar scent brings their entire presence rushing back, or the mourner wakes in the middle of the night with the powerful feeling that the departed is somehow near, and immediately the question that has been hiding beneath all the others becomes impossible to ignore. If the soul has truly moved beyond the physical body, why can its presence sometimes feel more real after death than it did during ordinary moments of life? This question has followed humanity for thousands of years because grief does something extraordinary to consciousness. It removes the physical person while leaving behind an enormous inner world filled with memories, habits, emotional impressions, unfinished conversations, expectations, and love. The body has disappeared from the room, yet the mind still knows precisely how that person walked into it. The voice is silent, yet you can still hear the exact way they pronounced your name. Their hands can no longer touch you, yet your own body remembers the feeling of their embrace. And this strange coexistence between physical absence and powerful inner presence can make the boundary between memory, dream, longing, and spiritual experience feel almost impossibly thin. The ancient Vedic vision of the human being helps us understand why such experiences have always been taken seriously without requiring us to make reckless claims about every dream or sensation. Human existence is not described merely as a physical machine that produces a personality and then becomes nothing when the machine stops. The Upanishadic tradition looks inward toward layers of consciousness deeper than ordinary waking experience and repeatedly explores the mystery of waking, dreaming, deep sleep, and the self that is not exhausted by any single state. This does not mean that every dream about a dead relative must be treated as a literal visit from that soul, but it does mean that the dream state was never dismissed as something spiritually meaningless, because dreams reveal that consciousness can experience vivid worlds, relationships, emotions, and encounters even when the physical senses are withdrawn from ordinary waking reality. Think about how mysterious a dream already is before death enters the question. Because while sleeping you may speak with someone who is thousands of miles away, walk through a house that no longer exists, return to childhood within seconds, meet someone you have not remembered consciously for 20 years, or feel love, terror, grief, and joy with such intensity that you wake with tears already running down your face. During the dream, you usually do not stop to ask how any of this is possible. The experience is simply happening, and only after waking does the ordinary mind return and begin dividing reality into what was physical and what was internal. Ancient Indian philosophy recognized the significance of this mystery long before modern people began discussing dreams through psychology, and therefore it is not surprising that grief, memory, and dreams became deeply intertwined in the human attempt to understand the soul's journey. When someone you love dies, the mind does not immediately update every part of itself to the new reality, because your entire nervous system has spent years expecting that person to exist. If you spoke with your mother every morning, some part of you still expects the call. If your husband slept beside you for 30 years, your body still expects his presence when you turn in bed. If your father always sat in the same chair, your eyes may move toward that chair automatically before conscious thought reminds you that it is now empty. And if your child used to run through the door at a certain hour, your attention may still respond to footsteps in the hallway. This is one reason grief can produce such vivid experiences, and acknowledging this psychological reality does not destroy the spiritual mystery. It simply reminds us to remain humble about what we claim to know. Yet there are dreams that grieving people describe very differently from ordinary dreams, because they do not feel chaotic, fragmented, or symbolic in the usual way. The departed may appear peaceful, say only a few words, offer an embrace, look directly at the dreamer, or simply stand somewhere familiar with an expression that remains unforgettable after waking. And the person may awaken not frightened, but strangely calm, sometimes carrying a peace that had been absent since the death. Some people interpret such dreams as the mind healing itself, others understand them as expressions of deep memory, and still others within spiritual traditions regard certain dreams as potentially meaningful encounters. But the most responsible position is not to force every experience into one explanation. What matters for the grieving person is often the effect. Did the experience deepen fear and obsession, or did it bring acceptance, gratitude, and peace? This distinction becomes extremely important because grief can make a vulnerable person search endlessly for signs, and once that search becomes compulsive, almost anything can be interpreted as proof that the departed is trying to communicate. A bird lands outside the window, and suddenly it must be a message. A light flickers, and immediately it must be the soul. A song plays unexpectedly, and it must have been sent by the dead. A number appears repeatedly, and the mourner begins constructing an entire hidden language around it. And while such coincidences can certainly feel emotionally meaningful, the ancient path of wisdom asks for discernment rather than desperation. The purpose of spirituality is not to make a grieving person more dependent upon signs. It should gradually make the heart steadier, clearer, and more capable of accepting what cannot be controlled. If every unusual event becomes a command to search for the departed, then grief has quietly changed its costume without changing its nature. The person may no longer be crying beside the body, but the mind is still refusing to release the relationship into its new form, because instead of saying, "I love you and I bless your journey," it says, "Prove that you are still here, show me again, send another sign, appear tonight. Tell me exactly where you are." This can become another form of attachment, and attachment is precisely what the ancient teachings repeatedly ask human beings to understand, because longing becomes dangerous when it refuses to allow either the departed or the living to move forward. There is therefore a great difference between receiving an unexpected dream with gratitude and demanding that the dead continually appear in order to relieve our fear. If a peaceful dream comes, you may hold it gently without claiming more than you know. You may say, "This brought me comfort, and I am grateful," rather than turning it into absolute proof about the metaphysical condition of another soul. The first response leaves room for mystery, while the second tries to possess mystery, and the Vedic spirit at its deepest is not about forcing the unseen world to obey our emotional needs. It is about learning how to live wisely in the presence of realities greater than our ordinary understanding. This matters because the original question of whether the soul knows that its family is grieving can easily become another demand for certainty. The grieving mind wants a simple answer because uncertainty feels unbearable. Tell me that my mother can hear me. Tell me that my father knows I apologized. Tell me that my child knows I still love them. Tell me that my husband knows I am trying to be strong. These questions are profoundly human, and no compassionate teaching should mock them. Yet perhaps the deeper spiritual response is not to promise knowledge that no living person can completely verify, but to show you what can be done regardless of that uncertainty. If the departed can in some manner receive the intention behind prayer and remembrance, then offer them peace. If they cannot receive it in the way you imagine, the prayer still purifies your own heart and transforms grief into something compassionate. So either way, the movement toward love, dignity, and release remains worthwhile. There is another reason dreams of the departed can become especially intense during periods of grief, and that is the power of unresolved emotion. The conversations we never completed do not disappear simply because the other person has died, and sometimes the dream becomes the place where the mind finally tries to finish what waking life could not finish. A daughter who never apologized may dream that her mother enters the room and smiles at her. A man who could not reach the hospital before his father died may dream of finally sitting beside him. Someone who lost a spouse suddenly may dream of receiving the goodbye that never came. And whether these dreams arise from the deeper mind or contain a mystery beyond the mind, their emotional significance can be enormous because they reveal what the heart has been carrying silently. The wise response to such a dream is not to become trapped inside it, but to listen carefully to what it awakens within you. If you wake realizing how much guilt you have been carrying, perhaps the dream is inviting you to forgive yourself. If you wake feeling that there was something you never said, perhaps you can speak those words inwardly during prayer or sacred remembrance. If the departed appears peaceful while you have imagined them suffering every night since the death, perhaps the dream can become permission to release an image that has been tormenting you. The value of the experience may not lie in proving where the soul physically or metaphysically appeared from. The value may lie in what the experience allows your own consciousness to transform. This is one of the most compassionate ways to understand the relationship between the living and the dead, because it prevents spirituality from becoming a competition over supernatural certainty. The grieving person does not need someone standing over them insisting that every dream is only meaningless brain activity, but neither do they need someone exploiting their vulnerability by claiming to know exactly what every dream means. Ancient wisdom is strongest when it protects mystery rather than pretending to own it, and here the mystery is enough. The human bond can continue shaping consciousness after physical separation. Dreams can bring experiences of extraordinary emotional intensity, and the soul's ultimate journey remains beyond the complete reach of ordinary sight. The Vedic understanding of memory and impression adds another layer to this, because experiences leave traces within consciousness, and the people who shape us most deeply become part of the inner landscape through which we continue living. A mother can die, yet decades later her child may still hear her moral instruction at the exact moment a difficult decision must be made. A teacher can be gone, yet the student may suddenly remember one sentence that changes the direction of an entire life. A father's physical voice may be silent, yet his courage can rise inside his son when fear appears. And a departed spouse's kindness can still influence how the survivor treats another human being years afterward. In this sense, the dead do not need to become ghosts standing beside us in order to remain extraordinarily present, because what they planted within consciousness continues participating in the world through the people they changed. This is perhaps one of the most beautiful ways to understand the phrase that someone lives on, because it does not require denying death. The body really did die, the physical relationship really did end, and pretending otherwise would only deepen confusion, yet the consequences of love remain alive in ways that are almost impossible to measure. A grandmother teaches a prayer to her daughter. The daughter teaches it to her son. The son repeats it to a child who never met the grandmother, and suddenly a voice that left the world decades earlier is still shaping a moment in the future. A father teaches honesty. His daughter carries it into her work. Someone benefits from her integrity, and a chain of goodness continues without anyone realizing where it began. The person is absent physically, yet the moral and emotional effects of their existence keep traveling. If the soul itself continues on another path, as Vedic and Upanishadic teachings maintain, then there are now two movements happening simultaneously. The departed soul moves according to its own journey, while the impressions it left within the living continue moving through this world. The family often confuses these two things because it believes that releasing the soul means losing the memory, but these are not the same. You can allow the departed to continue while still carrying what they taught you. You can stop begging them to return while still speaking their name with gratitude. You can accept that they are no longer physically present while still recognizing that your own life would be different if they had never existed. This understanding can become especially healing when grief is connected to fear that the departed will somehow be forgotten. Many people continue holding pain because pain feels like evidence of remembrance, and they fear that if they become peaceful, then the person will slowly disappear from the family. They imagine future birthdays where the name is no longer spoken, grandchildren who never hear the stories, belongings eventually given away, photographs moved into boxes, and one terrifying thought appears beneath it all. What if one day it is as though they were never here? This fear can make the mourner cling to suffering as a form of preservation, but memory does not require constant agony in order to remain real. In fact, peaceful remembrance often preserves a person more fully than traumatic grief does, because trauma keeps returning to the death while gratitude returns to the life. When the family begins healing, stories that were buried under shock slowly rise again. Someone remembers the ridiculous way the departed used to dance. Someone imitates a phrase they always said. Someone remembers the meal they cooked every winter. Someone admits how stubborn they could be, and everyone laughs. And suddenly the person becomes three-dimensional again, rather than being reduced to a photograph beside flowers. Healing does not erase them. Healing restores the parts of them that pain temporarily covered. This is also why dreams sometimes change as grief changes. In the early days, dreams may be frightening, confused, or filled with attempts to stop the death from happening, because the mind itself is still fighting reality. Later, the departed may appear healthier or more peaceful in dreams, or the dreamer may simply experience ordinary scenes of being together without the constant awareness that death occurred, and eventually the dreams may become less frequent. The disappearance of those dreams can frighten someone who interpreted them as the final connection. But perhaps their decreasing frequency does not mean the love has weakened. Perhaps it means the mind no longer needs to keep recreating the person every night in order to survive their absence. There may even come a night when you do not dream of them, a morning when you wake without immediately remembering the death, or an afternoon when several hours pass and you realize you were fully absorbed in your own life, and guilt may arrive instantly. You may think, how could I forget them for 3 hours? Yet this is not true forgetting. It is the nervous system learning that you are still allowed to exist. The person you loved occupied part of your life, perhaps an enormous part, but they were never meant to become the reason your remaining life must stop forever. And if their soul has its own path beyond death, then you also have a path that remains before you. This is where the doctrine of Dharma becomes deeply personal, because while grief looks backward, Dharma eventually asks what life is still asking of you now. Perhaps children still depend upon you. Perhaps aging parents still need your care. Perhaps work remains unfinished. Perhaps a promise must still be kept. Perhaps someone else is suffering, and your experience of loss has given you the compassion to understand them in a way you never could before. The person who died has crossed a threshold you cannot presently cross with them, but your breath continues, and as long as breath continues, life is still placing responsibilities, choices, and possibilities in your hands. The most mature form of remembrance, therefore, does not make the departed the center of every remaining moment. It allows their memory to strengthen the life that continues. If your father was brave, become braver. If your mother was generous, give more generously. If your spouse taught you patience, let that patience reach people they never met. If your child brought joy during a tragically short life, allow that joy to make you more tender toward other children, rather than allowing the tragedy to make your entire heart permanently dark. This is how the relationship can continue without becoming a chain, because what the departed gave you becomes movement rather than paralysis. And if the soul truly knows something of its family's grief, consider what kind of knowledge you would eventually want it to receive. In the beginning, perhaps it would know only that the house is broken, that everyone is crying, and that no one understands how to continue. This is natural because grief begins in shock. But would you want that to remain the only message forever? Years later, would you want the soul to encounter the same desperation, the same refusal, the same sentence repeated without end? Or would you want the emotional message gradually to change into something like, "We still love you, we still remember you, but we are learning to live with gratitude for the time we had"? There is extraordinary power in this change, because it means the family is no longer asking the departed to carry responsibility for their survival. A person who dies cannot continue playing every role they once played in the household, and when the living insist inwardly that they cannot move without them, they remain emotionally bound to a relationship that can no longer function in its former structure. Gradually, other family members must grow, responsibilities must move, younger people may have to become stronger, someone who was always protected may have to learn independence, and the death can become an unwilling initiation into a different stage of life. This can feel cruel at first, because nobody asked for the lesson, yet many of life's deepest transformations arrive without permission. A child becomes an adult because a parent is gone. A widow discovers strength she never knew she possessed. Siblings who rarely spoke become close because the person who connected them is no longer present. Or an entire family begins expressing love more openly because death taught them how dangerous it is to assume there will always be another opportunity. None of these changes make the death good, and spiritual wisdom should never insult grief by pretending every tragedy was secretly pleasant. But suffering can still produce awareness if we refuse to let it produce only destruction. This awareness may become one of the greatest offerings to the departed, because instead of saying, "Your death ended us," the family eventually becomes capable of saying, "Your life changed us." Notice the difference between those two sentences. The first gives death the final word, while the second gives life the final word. The first defines the person by the moment they were lost, while the second defines them by everything they gave before that moment, and the transition from one sentence to the other may take months or years, but when it happens, grief begins becoming wisdom. There is also a deeper Vedic truth hidden here concerning impermanence, because the family is not only grieving one person, it is confronting a law that applies to everyone sitting in the room. The same body that cries today will one day be mourned by someone else. The same hands that perform rites for a parent will eventually become still, and every relationship we treat as permanent is moving through time, whether we acknowledge it or not. Death shocks us because it reveals suddenly what life was quietly telling us every day. Nothing embodied can be held forever. This realization can make grief either darker or more sacred. It can lead to despair, in which nothing seems meaningful because everything ends, or it can lead to reverence, in which every ordinary moment becomes precious precisely because it does not last forever. You listen more carefully when someone speaks. You stop postponing forgiveness. You make the phone call. You say the words. You sit beside your parents while you still can. You stop assuming your children will always be small, and you understand that the meal everyone is complaining about today may one day become the memory someone would give anything to experience again. The departed therefore teaches the living without speaking, and perhaps this silent teaching is one of the greatest forms in which their presence continues. Their empty chair says, "Do not waste the chair that is still occupied." Their unanswered phone says, Call the person who can still answer. Their photograph says, "One day you will also become a memory, so decide what kind of memory your actions are creating now." Their death says, "Do not wait for loss to understand value." When grief begins producing this kind of awareness, it no longer exists only as suffering. It becomes a spiritual teacher. The pain may remain because love does not disappear, but the pain acquires direction, and this direction prevents the mourner from becoming permanently trapped between worlds, neither following the departed nor fully participating in the life that remains. Ancient wisdom repeatedly seeks balance because both extremes are dangerous. Forgetting the dead completely can become ingratitude, while refusing to release them can become attachment, and sacred remembrance stands between those extremes by honoring what was while accepting what is. This balance is especially important for people who continue feeling the departed nearby for long periods. If a sense of presence brings quiet comfort and does not interfere with ordinary life, it can simply be held with humility. But if it produces fear, obsession, sleeplessness, constant searching for signs, or an inability to function, then the wisest spiritual response is not to intensify the obsession by insisting that every sensation is supernatural. The heart may need grounding, community, trusted spiritual guidance, and the permission to return to ordinary life, because a true path toward peace should make a person more capable of living, not less. The same principle applies when family members interpret their experiences differently. One person may dream of the deceased repeatedly, while another never dreams of them at all. One may feel comfort in rituals, while another finds comfort in quiet remembrance. One may strongly believe the departed remains aware of the family, while another may remain uncertain, and grief becomes harder when relatives begin competing over whose experience proves greater love. The person who never dreams of the deceased did not love them less, and the person who dreams of them vividly should not assume they have been chosen as the only spiritual messenger for the family. Grief has different languages because human minds and relationships are different. This is a crucial teaching because families sometimes fracture after death, precisely when they most need unity. Arguments arise about rituals, belongings, inheritance, what the deceased would have wanted, who cared for them most, who was present at the end, or whose grief is more legitimate, and suddenly the person everyone claims to love becomes the reason the living begin hurting one another. If the departed soul knows that its family is grieving, imagine how tragic it would be if that grief turned into hatred between the very people who once gathered around the same person in love. Perhaps one of the most meaningful offerings a family can make after death is therefore reconciliation. If the loss reveals how temporary every relationship is, then continuing an unnecessary feud becomes even more absurd. If brothers stop speaking over property while performing rites for the father who raised them together, something essential has been forgotten. Sacred mourning should remind the living that another funeral will eventually come, another opportunity will disappear, and the words left unspoken today may become tomorrow's regret. This does not mean every wound can or should be ignored, and serious harm may require boundaries, but many family conflicts survive only because pride keeps feeding them. Death can expose the smallness of such pride by placing everyone in front of a reality none of them can control, and sometimes the most powerful way to honor the departed is for the living to stop repeating the bitterness that caused them pain while they were alive. A mother who spent years begging her children to remain close would hardly be honored by those same children refusing to speak after her death. A father who wanted peace in his household is not honored when his memory becomes a weapon used in new arguments. If the family wishes to send something toward the departed, then unity itself can become an offering. Sit together, remember together, forgive what can be forgiven, speak honestly, perform the duties that belong to you, and allow the person's death to make the family more conscious of love rather than more skilled at resentment. Perhaps no ritual vessel can contain an offering greater than a family deciding that death will not be allowed to multiply itself into emotional separation among those who remain. This brings us back to dreams, because sometimes the dream itself carries exactly this message. The deceased may appear surrounded by family, or the dreamer may hear a simple instruction to stop fighting, care for someone, or let go of a burden. And again, we cannot responsibly insist that every such dream came literally from the departed soul. Yet if the message directs the person toward compassion, reconciliation, responsibility and peace, there may still be wisdom in receiving it without turning it into superstition. The question need not always be, did they literally send this? Sometimes the more useful question is, what good is this experience asking me to do? That question protects the mourner from obsession because it moves attention away from proving the invisible and toward improving the visible. If a dream of your mother reminds you to care for your sister, then care for your sister. If remembering your father makes you realize you have become distant from your own children, sit with your children. If the image of your departed friend makes you recognize how short life can be, stop delaying the meaningful work you know you must do. Let remembrance produce action, because action is where grief begins turning into wisdom. There may still be nights when all of this understanding disappears and grief returns with the same force as the first day. Healing is not a straight road, and spiritual maturity does not mean you never collapse again. A smell, a date, a festival, an old message, a familiar street, or an empty place at the table can suddenly reopen everything, and you may wonder whether you have made any progress at all. But grief returning does not mean you have failed. It means love has memory, and memory does not obey calendars. The important question is not whether tears return, but what you do after they return. Do you allow them to become another reason to abandon your life, or do you let them pass through you and eventually return to the path before you? The strongest mourner is not the person who never cries. It is the person who can cry without allowing the tears to become a permanent command to stop living. This is the difference between grief being experienced and grief becoming an identity. Eventually, the relationship with the departed may become quieter. You may no longer need constant signs, constant dreams, constant conversations with their photograph, or constant reassurance that they knew you loved them. Something inside you begins trusting the life you shared, and that trust becomes stronger than the panic created by their absence. You know what they meant to you. You know what you meant to them as far as a human being can know such things, and the need to keep reopening the wound in order to prove the bond slowly fades. This quietness can feel almost sacred, because the person no longer exists only at the edge of your consciousness, screaming through loss. They become integrated into who you are. You carry them without constantly noticing that you are carrying them, just as a tree carries the soil from which it grew without staring at the ground every moment. Their influence becomes part of your decisions, your kindness, your caution, your strength, your humor, your habits, perhaps even the way you hold your own children. And in this form, their memory has moved from an external absence into an internal inheritance. Perhaps that is why the final stages of mourning are less about finding the departed and more about finding yourself after the departed is gone. At first you ask, where are they? But eventually life asks, who will you become now? At first you want proof that their soul knows you are grieving, but eventually another question emerges. If they could know how I am living, what would I want them to see? That question can change everything because it turns the relationship toward responsibility rather than helplessness. Would you want them to see you destroying yourself because they died? Or would you want them to see you carrying their love with strength? Would you want them to see a family torn apart by their absence, or one made more compassionate because everyone finally understood how temporary time together really is? Would you want them to see their memory used as an excuse for fear or as a source of courage? The answer is usually clear, even when living that answer is difficult. And perhaps this is the deeper purpose of every peaceful dream, every sacred remembrance, every prayer, every offering, and every quiet moment in which the departed suddenly feels near, not to keep the soul beside us forever, but to remind us of what love was trying to teach while we still had the person physically present. The signs, if signs they are, should not become chains. The dreams, if meaningful, should not become demands. The memories should not become prisons. Everything should gradually point in one direction, toward gratitude, responsibility, release, and the recognition that both the departed and the living must continue along paths that are no longer physically shared. So if someone you loved appears in a dream tonight, you do not need to force an explanation. You do not need to tell yourself immediately that it was meaningless, and you do not need to declare with certainty that the soul crossed worlds to visit you. Receive the experience gently. Notice what it leaves inside you, and if it brings peace, let the peace remain. If it awakens forgiveness, forgive. If it reminds you to live, live. If it makes you grateful, become grateful. If it simply makes you cry, then cry without turning the tears into another chain. And if no dream ever comes, do not believe for 1 second that your love was less worthy, because the deepest bonds do not require supernatural confirmation in order to have been real. You know the meals you shared, the arguments you survived, the hands you held, the sacrifices you witnessed, the laughter that filled ordinary days, and the final emptiness that appeared because someone truly mattered. That history does not become false because the departed never appears in sleep. The soul's journey remains a mystery beyond the complete reach of physical sight, but the duty of the living becomes increasingly clear. Remember without imprisoning, grieve without destroying yourself, honor without demanding signs, pray without trying to control the unseen, and let whatever love survives the separation become a force that makes your remaining life deeper rather than smaller. Because perhaps the departed does not need to keep appearing for you to know that something profound remains. Perhaps the greatest sign is already inside you. It is the way their absence changed what you now understand about presence, the way their death changed what you now understand about time, the way your grief revealed how deeply you were capable of loving, and the way their memory can still make you choose kindness long after their physical hands can no longer guide yours. And once the family reaches this point, one final and even greater question remains, because eventually every ritual is completed, every visitor leaves, the dreams become quieter, and the years begin moving forward, yet the soul itself must continue toward whatever comes next. If the departed can know the grief of those it leaves behind during the transition, is there a moment when that connection begins to loosen, when the soul turns away from the world it knew and fully accepts the path ahead? And what must the family do when that final moment of release arrives? Chapter 7. The Final Release. When love stops calling the soul back. There comes a point in grief when the deepest question is no longer whether the departed soul knows that the family is crying, whether it can somehow sense the prayers being offered, whether a dream carried meaning, or whether the bond created during life continues for some mysterious period after death, because eventually another truth begins pressing itself upon the heart. Whatever connection remains, the soul cannot be asked to remain forever at the doorway of the life it has already left. The body has completed its part. The physical relationship has changed beyond reversal. The sacred rites have been performed. The relatives have gathered and departed. The first terrible nights have passed, and the soul, according to the ancient Hindu understanding of death, belongs to a journey whose destination cannot be determined by the desperate wishes of those standing behind it. This is where grief reaches its most difficult lesson, because the family that spent days praying for the departed must eventually learn to stop calling the departed backward, and the love that once expressed itself through holding must become strong enough to express itself through release. For the human heart, this can feel almost impossible because everything about love during life teaches us to prevent separation. When a child walks toward danger, the mother pulls them back. When a husband leaves for a long journey, his wife asks when he will return. When someone is sick, the family fights desperately to keep them alive. When a loved one is late coming home, we wait for the sound of the door, because reunion is the natural desire of affection. Throughout life, love repeatedly says, "Stay," and therefore death demands something that feels completely unnatural. After years of asking someone to remain, grief must somehow learn to say, "Go in peace." It is not surprising that the heart resists this sentence, because it sounds like surrender when we first hear it. Yet ancient spiritual wisdom suggests that there are moments when surrender is not the opposite of love, but its final purification. The Rig Vedic funeral vision points the departed onward toward the ancient path of those who came before, toward Yama and the ancestors, and whatever theological interpretation one gives these ancient hymns, their direction is unmistakable. Death is portrayed as passage rather than permanent suspension beside the world of the living. The soul is not instructed to remain forever beside the house, beside the possessions, beside the bed, or beside the people who cannot stop crying. The imagery directs consciousness toward another order of existence, reminding the living that the person they love has entered a mystery older than any individual family. Generations before us stood beside fires, graves, rivers, and bodies, asking the same questions we ask today, and generation after generation had to learn the same painful truth that no amount of love grants the living ownership over another being's journey. This does not make family bonds meaningless. It makes them sacred precisely because they were never permanent possessions. A parent receives a child but does not own the child forever. A husband walks with his wife but cannot command how long their shared years will last. Siblings grow from the same household but eventually take different roads, and every relationship is a temporary meeting between lives that remain subject to time, change, karma, circumstance, and death. The tragedy of grief is that we often understand this only after the relationship has ended, when suddenly every ordinary moment we once ignored becomes precious, and the heart realizes that what it called mine was actually something entrusted to it for an unknown number of years. Perhaps this is one of the reasons death feels like theft, because we unconsciously behave as though love gave us a permanent claim. We say, "my mother," "my husband," "my daughter," "my brother," and these words are natural expressions of relationship, yet hidden inside them can be a subtle assumption that the person belongs to our life indefinitely. When death arrives, reality breaks that assumption with brutal force and reveals that the person was never a possession. They were a presence, a gift, a responsibility, a fellow traveler whose path happened to intersect with ours. The deeper spiritual shift begins when grief stops asking, "Why was what belonged to me taken away?" and slowly begins asking, "What was I given while this person walked beside me, and how can I honor that gift now that their path has moved beyond mine?" This change does not happen in one night. The heart may understand intellectually that the soul must continue, while emotionally refusing to accept it for years, because knowledge and acceptance are not the same thing. Someone can repeat that death is inevitable and still collapse when it touches their own home. Someone can have studied scripture for decades and still ask why this particular person had to die. Someone can believe firmly in the continuation of the soul and still ache for one more physical embrace. Spiritual teaching should never insult such pain by pretending that correct philosophy automatically removes grief, because the purpose of wisdom is not to make human beings less human. It is to guide their humanity toward a place where suffering no longer completely controls them. The final release begins quietly, often without any dramatic spiritual experience. It may begin when the family finally removes some belongings without feeling that they are erasing the person, when someone opens a room that has remained closed, when the widow changes something in the house for the first time, when the son gives away his father's clothes to someone who needs them, or when the mother of a departed child can speak the child's name without immediately entering the worst moment of the loss. These acts may look ordinary to outsiders, yet internally they represent something enormous, The living person is acknowledging that the relationship cannot continue in its former physical structure and is beginning to allow love to exist without requiring the environment to remain frozen exactly as it was on the day before death. Many mourners resist such changes because objects become anchors. A shirt still carries a familiar scent, a cup remains where the person left it, messages remain on a phone, a pair of shoes remains beside the door, and touching these things can feel like touching the final physical boundary between presence and absence. There is nothing wrong with keeping meaningful objects, and there is no spiritual rule requiring someone to erase every physical reminder, but the question gradually becomes whether the object helps preserve loving memory, or whether it has become part of an emotional prison that prevents life from moving. The same photograph can be a source of gratitude in one heart and a source of endless self-punishment in another, because the power lies not only in the object, but in the relationship the mourner has created with it. This is why release cannot be measured by external behavior. One person may give away belongings quickly and remain inwardly consumed by grief for years, while another may keep a room largely unchanged, yet continue living with peace and clarity. The real transformation is internal and can be recognized by one central movement. The heart gradually stops demanding that reality be different from what it is. It may still wish the person had lived longer, it may still ache at anniversaries, it may still cry unexpectedly, but beneath those waves, something has changed because the mourner no longer spends every day fighting the fact of death. This acceptance is sometimes misunderstood as approval, but accepting that someone died does not mean believing their death was fair, desirable, or emotionally easy. It means acknowledging that the event belongs to the past and cannot be altered by continued resistance. The heart can say, "I would have chosen differently if I had the power, but I do not have that power, and I will not sacrifice every remaining year to a battle against what cannot now be changed." This is not weakness. It may require more strength than the original resistance because anger, denial, and desperate longing often feel active, while acceptance requires the painful humility of recognizing the limits of human control. The ancient teachings surrounding karma add another dimension to this humility because they insist that life unfolds within a network of causes far beyond the limited view of one moment. And although no responsible teacher should look at a grieving person and arrogantly declare that a particular tragedy occurred because of some specific past action, the broader principle reminds us that every soul has a journey larger than the role it temporarily played in our family. Your father was your father, but his existence was not exhausted by being your father. Your wife was your wife, but her soul cannot be reduced only to the relationship she had with you. Your child was your child in this life, yet the deepest spiritual understanding of the soul refuses to define consciousness only through one temporary family identity. This can be difficult to accept because grief naturally centers our own relationship. But release requires recognizing that the departed belongs ultimately to a journey larger than our personal need. Imagine two travelers who meet on a road and walk together for many miles. They share food, protect each other through storms, laugh beside the fire, help one another over dangerous ground, and eventually reach a place where their paths separate. One traveler continues east while the other must go north, and because the bond has become deep, each wishes the road could remain shared, yet neither can fulfill the journey by refusing the separation. The value of everything they experience together is not destroyed because the path divides. In fact, what they gave one another may become the very strength each uses on the road ahead. Human relationships can be understood in this way because a lifetime together can matter completely without lasting physically forever. This perspective becomes especially powerful when the family asks whether the soul knows they are grieving, because perhaps the most compassionate answer is not to focus indefinitely on whether the soul remains aware of every tear, but to ask what awareness the family wishes to send if any connection remains. In the first hours and days after death, the answer may be unavoidable sorrow because the wound is fresh and no one should be expected to turn shock instantly into wisdom. But as time passes, the message can mature. At first it may be, "Please do not leave." Later, "I cannot believe you are gone." Later still, "I miss you terribly." And eventually, after grief has done its work, "I love you enough to stop asking you to remain tied to my inability to let go." There is something almost sacred about that final sentence, because it does not deny the relationship. It reveals how deeply the relationship has been purified. During life, we often love people, partly because of what they give us: companionship, security, identity, affection, guidance, belonging, financial support, protection, routine, and the comfort of not being alone. Death removes those benefits and confronts us with the question of whether love can remain when there is nothing left to receive physically. If it can, then the relationship enters a different moral quality, because the mourner begins wishing peace for the departed, even when that peace requires accepting permanent separation. This is why the difference between love and possession becomes so important at the end of grief. Possession says, "Remain connected to me because I need you," while love says, "May you move toward what is right for your journey, even though my heart wishes I could keep you here." Possession measures loyalty through suffering, while love eventually recognizes that endless self-destruction serves neither person. Possession wants proof that the departed remains nearby, while love can tolerate mystery. Possession repeatedly asks for signs, while love can become grateful even without them. Possession wants the past restored, while love carries the past without demanding that it become the present again. Many people arrive at this stage after a final inner conversation with the departed, whether during prayer, meditation, ritual, or simply while sitting alone in the room where so many memories remain. They may speak aloud or silently and say everything that grief has been carrying. "I am angry that you left. I am sorry for what I did wrong. I forgive you for what hurt me. I wish we had more time. I wish I had said thank you. I wish I had listened. I wish you could see what has happened since you left. I miss you every day, but I do not want my pain to become the only thing connecting us." There may be no voice answering from the unseen, yet something in the mourner can still change because the conversation finally completes an emotional movement that had remained unfinished. Forgiveness often becomes central here because nothing binds the living to the dead more painfully than unresolved conflict. Love may survive death, but resentment can survive it too, and sometimes the mourner spends years arguing with a person who can no longer physically answer. A father dies before apologizing for years of emotional distance. A sibling dies after a final disagreement. A spouse dies while the marriage was strained, or someone loses a parent with whom the relationship contained both deep love and deep wounds, and grief becomes complicated because the mourner does not know whether to cry, feel angry, feel relieved, feel guilty, or feel all of these at once. The spiritual path does not require pretending that harmful behavior was acceptable simply because someone died. Death does not turn every person into a saint, and honest remembrance should not demand the erasure of pain. Yet the mourner can eventually decide whether the wound will continue governing their consciousness long after the person who created it is gone. Forgiveness, when possible and appropriate, becomes less about excusing the dead and more about releasing the living from the obligation to keep carrying the injury. One can say, "What happened was real, what it did to me was real, but I refuse to allow this wound to be the final relationship between us." If the soul somehow remains aware of its family for a period after death, imagine the power of such forgiveness. Instead of being held within a field of accusation, unfinished anger, and repeated emotional conflict, the departed is remembered with a clarity that acknowledges both love and imperfection, and the family chooses not to make resentment the final offering. Whether one interprets this metaphysically or psychologically, the result is still profound because the emotional atmosphere changes from entanglement toward peace. The same transformation must eventually happen with guilt. Many people secretly punish themselves because they were not present when the person died, because they missed the final phone call, because they lost patience during illness, because they were busy when they should have visited, or because some ordinary argument became the last conversation. Grief takes one imperfect moment and places it under a magnifying glass until the mourner believes it defines the entire relationship. Yet no relationship should be reduced to its final mistake. If you loved someone for 20 years, one harsh sentence does not erase 20 years. If your mother knew your affection through thousands of acts, the fact that you were not beside her during the final breath does not automatically become the only truth she ever knew. Release requires allowing the whole relationship to speak louder than the worst moment. This does not mean avoiding responsibility. If regret reveals a real failure, let it change how you treat the living, because that is far more meaningful than spending decades punishing yourself for something that can no longer be physically corrected. Call the person you keep postponing. Apologize while there is still time. Visit your parents. Speak tenderness before the hospital room forces you to wish you had, and allow the dead to teach you how to love the living more consciously. Then even regret becomes transformed into dharma. This is one of the greatest ways the departed continues to affect the family without needing to remain physically present. Death can rearrange priorities overnight, because things that seemed enormous suddenly become small, and things taken for granted suddenly become sacred. A family that argued about money may realize how meaningless the argument looks beside a body that cannot carry money anywhere. Someone obsessed with work may understand that no achievement can purchase another hour with the person already gone. A son who postponed visiting his father may suddenly recognize that time is the only wealth that cannot be borrowed after it is spent. The dead therefore become silent teachers of impermanence, and the wisest tribute is to allow the teaching to alter how the living spend the years that remain. This brings us to the idea of remembrance without captivity, which may be one of the hardest balances to achieve. Some people fear that release means the departed will gradually disappear, but true remembrance does not require keeping pain constantly fresh. You can remember without reopening the wound every morning. You can love without refusing to smile. You can honor someone without making every future decision according to what happened at their death. And you can build new relationships without betraying old ones. A widow who eventually feels companionship again has not erased her husband. A parent who laughs again has not forgotten a lost child, and a son who lives joyfully has not abandoned his father's memory. The heart is capable of holding more than one truth at once. It can say, "I will always miss you, and I am grateful to be alive." It can say, "Part of me changed forever when you died, and I am still allowed to change in new ways." It can say, "No one will replace you, and other people may still enter my life." Grief becomes destructive when it insists that loyalty requires choosing only one side, because then love becomes a prohibition against life itself. If the departed soul knows its family is grieving, perhaps nothing could be more peaceful than knowing that grief did not become the destruction of everything they loved. Imagine a father whose greatest concern was always his children's future. Would his memory be better honored by those children abandoning their futures, or by becoming strong enough to build them? Imagine a mother who spent years sacrificing for her family. Would love be proven by allowing her death to dissolve the family, or by protecting the unity she spent her life creating? Imagine a spouse who always wanted you to experience joy. Would refusing joy forever truly become the highest expression of fidelity? These questions are difficult because grief sometimes becomes attached to identity. A person may become the widow, the mother who lost a child, the son whose father died, and eventually the pain becomes so intertwined with the self that healing feels like losing not only the departed, but also the identity created through mourning. People may ask about the loss less often, friends may stop checking in, anniversaries may pass without others remembering, and the mourner can feel strangely abandoned by the world because everyone else seems to have moved on. In that loneliness, holding tightly to grief may feel like the only way to ensure that the person is not forgotten, but the memory of someone does not depend upon remaining visibly devastated. There are quieter and more enduring ways to carry them. You may use a phrase they taught you, cook their food, tell their stories to people who never met them, keep one object that carries meaning, perform a yearly act of charity, continue a family tradition, or simply allow their values to become part of how you move through the world. None of these acts require you to remain emotionally frozen, and in fact they may preserve the person more beautifully than constant suffering because they carry forward the life rather than endlessly repeating the death. This is where ancestors become meaningful in Vedic and broader Hindu understanding, because the departed is gradually no longer only the person who died last year. They become part of the ancestral line from which the living receive memory, identity, duty, and gratitude. The relationship becomes wider. The grandfather who once sat at the table may one day be known to great-grandchildren only through stories, yet his choices may still affect the family generations later. The grandmother who endured hardship may become a source of strength for descendants who never heard her voice. And the values carried from one generation to another reveal that physical absence does not make a life inconsequential. When a family understands this, the fear of forgetting begins to soften because the departed does not need to remain psychologically trapped inside the house in order to remain part of the family story. They have moved from daily presence into inheritance, and inheritance includes far more than money or possessions. It includes courage, habits, wounds, wisdom, traditions, prayers, mistakes, humor, and ways of seeing the world. Every generation receives something from those before it, and then decides what to preserve, what to heal, and what to transform. Sometimes honoring the departed means continuing what they began, but sometimes it means ending what they could not heal. A family may inherit anger, silence, addiction, fear, or destructive patterns along with love, and death can become the moment when someone decides that the chain will not continue. A son may say, "My father suffered because he never expressed emotion, but I will speak openly with my children." Or a daughter may say, "My mother remained trapped in fear, and I will honor her by building the courage she wanted for me." This too can be sacred remembrance, because honoring ancestors does not require reproducing every limitation they carried. The release of the departed therefore becomes linked with the liberation of the living. If the family continues repeating every wound, then the dead remain present through pain. If the family transforms those wounds into wisdom, then the dead become part of healing. The question is no longer merely whether the soul knows the family is grieving, but whether grief itself will become another karmic pattern passed downward, or a place where awareness finally interrupts the pattern. There are families in which a death brings people together, and families in which it tears them apart. Property disputes begin, old resentments return, siblings accuse one another of not doing enough, someone claims greater ownership over the memory of the deceased, and within months the person who connected everyone becomes the reason they stop speaking. If there is any sense in which the departed remains aware of the family, this may be one of the most painful possibilities to contemplate, because love for the dead becomes an excuse for cruelty among the living. The final release, therefore, asks not only whether you can let the soul go, but whether you can stop using grief to hurt those who remain. A mother dies, and 3 children argue over her possessions, while forgetting that the person they claim to honor spent years asking them to care for one another. A father dies, and unresolved competition between brothers becomes worse, even though his deepest wish was family unity. At that moment, the dead do not need another flower. Perhaps they need the living to remember what their life actually stood for. Reconciliation can therefore become one of the most meaningful offerings after death. This does not mean ignoring abuse or abandoning necessary boundaries, but where the conflict is sustained only by pride, Grief exposes how expensive pride can become. The person you refuse to call today may be the photograph you cry beside tomorrow, and death gives no promise that you will receive one final opportunity to correct what you postponed. A funeral often fills a room with people saying things they wish they had said while the person was alive. Wisdom is learning to say them earlier. This is one of death's most severe teachings. There is no guaranteed later. The apology you postpone, the gratitude you assume someone already knows, the visit you delay, the affection you feel embarrassed to express, and the conversation you keep avoiding all depend upon a future that may not arrive. The departed cannot change this lesson for themselves anymore, but their absence can teach it to everyone who remains, and perhaps this is why grief, when deeply understood, can make a human being more awake rather than merely more sad. As the family moves toward this awakening, the question of signs often becomes less urgent. At first, you may desperately want confirmation that the soul knows you are grieving because uncertainty feels unbearable, but over time another understanding can develop. Perhaps you do not need continuous proof in order to love well. You do not need a light to flicker, a dream to repeat, or a bird to appear every time you miss them. The relationship was real because it was lived, and the love was real because it shaped you. The soul may be somewhere beyond what the senses can reach, and the mystery can remain a mystery without reducing the truth of what happened between you. There is spiritual maturity in allowing mystery to remain unsolved. Human beings often want a map of the unseen world because maps create the illusion of control, yet death refuses to become fully manageable. Scriptures provide teachings, traditions preserve visions, philosophers describe the nature of the self, and rituals give structure to the transition, but no living person possesses ordinary sensory access to every detail of another soul's post-death experience. Humility, therefore, becomes essential. We can honor ancient teachings without turning them into claims beyond what they actually say, and we can comfort the grieving without pretending that every unknown has been settled. This humility makes the final release stronger rather than weaker, because the family can say, "I do not know exactly what you now experience, I do not know exactly whether you perceive my words, and I do not know what part of the journey lies before you, but I know what I want my love to become. I want it to become peaceful rather than possessive, grateful rather than desperate, and strong enough to allow both of us to continue." Such a statement requires no supernatural proof in order to transform the heart. The day may come when you visit the place where the person was cremated or buried, or perhaps simply sit beside their photograph and realize that you have stopped expecting them to return. This realization can produce another wave of sadness because final acceptance carries its own grief. Somewhere inside you, a tiny impossible hope may have survived even after the mind knew better, and releasing that hope can feel like losing the person one more time. Yet this second loss is different from the first because it is not the death of the person, it is the death of resistance. Once resistance begins fading, something surprising may enter the space it occupied: gratitude. At first, gratitude may sound almost offensive because grief says, "How can I be grateful when they were taken?" But eventually the question changes into, "How extraordinary that among all the lives in this world, our paths met at all." Instead of measuring only the years that were lost, the heart begins seeing the years that were given. 20 years with someone can be mourned as only 20 years, or treasured as 20 years I would never erase, even knowing how painful the ending would be. This is one of grief's most powerful transformations, because gratitude stops arguing with time. It no longer says, "I deserved more," even though the wish for more may remain. It says, "What I received mattered." A mother may still wish her child had lived to old age, while being grateful for every day she was given. A widow may still wish for another 30 years, while recognizing the beauty of the 20 she had. And a son may still wish his father had seen his future, while feeling grateful for everything his father placed inside him before leaving. When gratitude becomes stronger than possession, the soul is no longer remembered only as the cause of pain. The person's life reappears. Their smile returns before their final illness. Their voice returns before the last conversation. Their personality returns before the funeral, and the family begins speaking of them with warmth, instead of only whispering about how they died. This is the moment when death loses its attempt to become the entire meaning of the person. No one should be remembered only by their final breath. A human life contains thousands of mornings, ordinary meals, mistakes, celebrations, private jokes, sacrifices, failures, acts of courage, small kindnesses, arguments, reconciliations, and moments nobody photographed. And the sacred duty of memory is to preserve that fullness. When grief reduces someone to the fact that they died, love restores everything that happened before death. Perhaps the departed soul, if aware of anything from its family, would want to be known this way as well. Not eternally as the wound everyone points toward, but as the person whose existence enriched those who survived. Would a loving mother want her children to mention her name only with collapse, or would she also want them to remember her laughter? Would a husband want every anniversary to become only a day of suffering, or might he want his wife to remember how much joy they shared? Would a departed child want their brief life remembered only through the hospital, or also through the brightness they brought before tragedy arrived? This is why the final release can contain laughter without disrespect. Families sometimes feel shocked the first time someone tells a funny story about the departed, and everyone laughs during a period of mourning. Yet laughter may be one of the purest signs that the whole person is returning to memory. Grief does not have to monopolize remembrance. Love contained joy before death, and joy is allowed to remain part of love afterward. As this happens, the person begins occupying a different place inside consciousness. In the beginning, the absence is outside you, the empty chair, the silent room, the phone that no longer rings. Later, the relationship becomes internalized. You recognize their influence in your own reactions, expressions, values, and choices. The person becomes less like someone you are waiting to return, and more like someone whose presence helped create who you have become. This may be the most profound way of carrying the departed without binding them. You do not have to imagine them trapped near you, because their life has already entered you through memory and influence. The father is present in the courage he taught, the mother in the tenderness she modeled, the teacher in the sentence the student never forgot, the spouse in the maturity built through years of companionship, and the child in the capacity for love that their existence awakened. These are not supernatural claims. They are observable realities about how deeply human beings shape one another. Then the question, does the soul know that we are grieving, begins to acquire a final answer of another kind. Perhaps the ancient teachings invite us to believe that the departed may remain meaningfully connected to the rites, intentions, and emotions of the family during the post-death transition. But even within that worldview, the purpose is not for the soul to remain forever watching grief. The journey is meant to continue. Therefore, if the soul knows our sorrow at all, perhaps our responsibility is to ensure that sorrow gradually becomes something the soul need not remain concerned about. Imagine being able to send one final message beyond the boundary of death. At first, you might want to ask 1,000 questions. Where are you? Are you safe? Can you hear me? Did you know how much I loved you? Were you afraid? Do you remember us? Yet if only one message could truly travel, perhaps the most loving message would not be a question at all. Perhaps it would be a release. Do not worry about us forever. We are hurt, but we will learn. We are crying, but we will stand again. We will remember you without asking you to remain behind. Continue your journey in peace. There is enormous dignity in that message because it removes a burden from love. The departed is no longer responsible for making the family feel safe, giving them signs, appearing in dreams, or somehow proving that death did not destroy the relationship. The family accepts responsibility for its own healing, and allows the departed to belong to whatever comes next. This does not mean all communication in the heart must stop. People may continue speaking inwardly to those they lost for the rest of their lives, and such moments can be harmless and deeply meaningful. The difference lies in whether these conversations arise from gratitude or refusal. Saying, "I wish you could see this, you would have been proud," can be a tender way of remembering, while constantly begging the person to prove they remain nearby may reveal that acceptance is still struggling to emerge. Spiritual maturity is not measured by never speaking to the dead. It is measured by whether the relationship with memory supports life rather than replacing it. The same is true of anniversaries. The date of death may remain emotionally powerful for decades, yet over time the family may choose to remember the birthday, the wedding, the person's favorite season, or an ordinary tradition as strongly as the day they died. This shift matters because it rebalances memory toward life. You can light a lamp, prepare their favorite food, gather the family, give charity, tell stories, or simply spend a quiet moment in gratitude without turning remembrance into a yearly return to trauma. The ancient emphasis on rites and ancestors offers exactly this kind of structure, because remembrance is given a place rather than allowed to consume every place. There are times for honoring the dead and times for fulfilling responsibilities among the living. This balance protects both sides of human existence. We neither forget those who came before, nor neglect those who are still here. There is a profound ethical lesson inside that balance, because sometimes people become so devoted to the dead that they fail the living. A parent spends all emotional energy mourning one child, while another child beside them becomes invisible. A widow becomes so consumed with loss that her young children stop receiving the care they need, or siblings spend years performing elaborate remembrance while refusing to forgive each other. At that point, grief, however understandable, has begun violating the responsibilities that remain. Dharma calls the mourner back toward those responsibilities. The soul that has departed belongs to its path, while the people still breathing belong partly to one another. A living child needs your embrace more urgently than a photograph needs your tears. An aging parent needs your visit while there is still time. And a spouse beside you deserves presence rather than being forced to compete endlessly with an idealized memory. Honoring the departed should deepen our care for the living, not make us absent from them. If this chapter carries one truth above all others, it is that release is not the end of love. It is the end of demanding that love remain in its old form. The relationship does not become meaningless when you stop pleading for return. In fact, it can become purer because what remains is no longer dependent upon possession, physical presence, or fear. There may come a morning when you wake and realize that you have not dreamed of the person for months, and instead of panic, there is peace. There may come an evening when you speak their name and smile. There may come a family gathering when younger people ask about them and you tell the story without becoming unable to continue. There may come a moment when you look at their photograph and the first thought is not, "Why did you leave?" but, "I am grateful you were here." That moment is not forgetting, it is healing. And perhaps if the soul knows anything of the family it left behind, that is one of the most beautiful things it could ever know, that the people who cried at its departure did not stop loving, but they learned how to carry that love without allowing it to destroy them. The family still remembers. The prayers still carry reverence. The stories still return. The sacred name of the departed may still be spoken, yet the hands that once clung have slowly opened, and when the hands open, something extraordinary happens. They become capable of giving again. They can feed someone. They can comfort someone else who is grieving. They can hold a child. They can serve an aging parent. They can rebuild relationships. They can create something meaningful. They can become the instruments through which the love once received from the departed continues entering the world. This may be the greatest memorial of all, because stone eventually wears away, photographs fade. houses change owners, possessions disappear, and even names may become distant across generations. But goodness passed from one person into another can continue far beyond what either of them ever sees. Someone who died decades ago can still influence a kindness performed today if the person they loved learned compassion from them, and in this sense the consequences of a life travel farther than the body ever could. So perhaps we should stop asking only whether the soul knows when its family is grieving, and begin asking whether the soul, if it could see the entire future of those it loved, would recognize what its life continued to create. Would it see a family permanently broken, or a family made more conscious? Would it see fear, or courage born from loss? Would it see endless bitterness, or forgiveness? Would it see people spending the rest of their lives standing beside the door of death, or would it see them walking forward while carrying love inside them? The answer depends partly on the living. Death makes a decision for us that we never wanted, but grief eventually places another decision in our hands. What will we become because this person was here, and what will we become because they are gone? We can become smaller, frightened of loving anyone deeply because loss may return, or we can become more courageous because loss has shown us how precious love is. We can become bitter because life refused to give us permanence, or grateful because it gave us the relationship at all. We can spend years demanding an explanation from the unseen, or use those years to become the person our loved one hoped we would become. We can keep saying, "Come back," or slowly learn the sentence that the ancient path of death eventually asks every grieving heart to say, "Go forward, and I will go forward too." Not toward the same destination, not through the same world, not through the same body, but forward according to the path now belonging to each. The soul follows the mystery beyond death, the family follows the duties of life, and love becomes the bridge between two journeys that can no longer be physically shared. Perhaps one day the grieving person will understand that this was the meaning hidden inside the tears from the beginning. They thought they were crying only because someone had disappeared, but the tears were also washing away an old illusion, the belief that love means being able to keep someone forever. We cannot. No human being has ever succeeded. Kings could not, sages could not, the wealthy could not, the powerful could not. Every generation receives the people it loves for a time, and eventually time asks for them back. What remains in our control is not whether separation comes. What remains in our control is the quality of love before it comes, and the quality of remembrance after. Love them while they are here. Speak what needs to be spoken. Forgive while there is someone to hear the forgiveness. Sit beside them while the chair is occupied. Listen while the voice still answers. Do not wait for death to make ordinary moments sacred, and when death eventually arrives, as it does for every embodied being, cry because you are human, remember because the relationship mattered, perform the sacred duties because tradition gives grief direction, pray because the heart still wants to give, and then, slowly, when the time inside you is ready, release because love must not become a chain. If there is any awareness in the soul of the family's grief, let that awareness eventually meet peace. Let the soul, in whatever mystery lies beyond physical perception, no longer be called backward by panic. Let your memory say, "You were loved." Let your prayer say, "You are blessed." Let your gratitude say, "Your life mattered." And let your acceptance say, "You do not have to remain because I am afraid to continue without you." There is perhaps no more powerful form of love than this, because it asks nothing in return, no sign, no dream, no proof, no return. It simply gives a blessing. And perhaps that is why the ancient path of death is ultimately not only about the journey of the departed soul, it is also about the transformation of those left behind. The departed must leave the body, the family must release possession, the soul must move toward whatever lies beyond. The living must return to Dharma, the dead become ancestors, the grieving become wiser, and love, if allowed to mature completely, becomes neither denial nor attachment, but a quiet force that can survive even when two beings no longer inhabit the same world. So when the question returns late at night, when you look at the empty place where someone once sat and wonder, do they know I am still grieving? Perhaps you can answer your own heart in a different way. Maybe they know, maybe the deepest details remain beyond us. But if your love could reach them now, what would you want it to carry? Not only tears, not only fear, not only the endless echo of "Why did you leave me?" Let it carry something greater. Let it say, "I cried because you mattered. I held on because losing you was harder than I knew how to bear. I searched for you because the silence frightened me. I wished you would return because life without you felt impossible. But now I understand that loving you does not give me the right to hold your journey still. I will remember you without imprisoning you. I will honor you without destroying myself. I will carry what you gave me into the life that remains. Wherever your path has taken you, go peacefully. You do not need to turn back because of my tears." And when a grieving heart can finally say those words and mean them, death has not won. The body may be gone, the voice may be silent, the room may never look exactly the same. But love has survived without becoming a prison. The soul is allowed to continue, the family is allowed to heal, and the final bond between them is no longer made only of grief. It is made of gratitude, remembrance, blessing, and peace. That is the final lesson. The deepest love does not prove itself by calling the soul back forever. It proves itself when, through tears, it finally becomes strong enough to bless the soul forward. So when you miss someone tonight, and the silence of their absence feels heavier than words, remember this. The ancient Vedic path does not ask you to forget them, and it does not ask you to become cold. It asks you to love them in a way that slowly changes grief into blessing. Cry if you need to cry. Remember their voice, speak their name, honor what they gave you. Perform the sacred duties of your tradition with sincerity. But do not believe that endless suffering is the only proof of love, because the deepest love is not the love that keeps calling the departed backward. It is the love that can finally say, "You were deeply loved, you are still remembered, and you may continue your journey in peace." If the soul can know something of the family it has left behind, then let it know more than your pain. Let it know your gratitude. Let it know that the life it touched is still moving. Let it know that the family will carry its memory without turning that memory into a chain, and that the goodness it placed into this world will continue through the people who remain. One day your tears may still come, but they will no longer say only, "Why did you leave?" They may begin to say, "Thank you for being here." And when grief reaches that point, something sacred has happened, because the heart has stopped fighting the journey and has begun honoring it. So if there is someone you have lost, close your eyes for a moment and offer them this blessing from the deepest place within you. I miss you. I remember you. I am grateful for you. Wherever your journey now leads, may you go in peace. I will not hold you with my sorrow. I will carry you with my love. And perhaps that is the final mystery the Vedic teachings leave with us. Death may separate bodies, but it does not make love meaningless. Love simply has to learn a new form. If this message touched something in your heart, share it with someone who is grieving, and subscribe to Akashic Vedas for more ancient teachings on the soul, karma, death, rebirth, and the mysteries that begin where the physical world ends. Until we meet again, may the departed find their path, may the grieving find their strength, and may every tear slowly become a blessing, because true love does not beg the soul to return. True love remembers, blesses, and finally lets it go in peace.